Hello everybody, once again we're going to hit you up with another presidential election. This one, the election of 1928. Two new candidates going at it to see who will win the White House. Let's see who that is right now. Now, as always, we're going to start off with the incumbent party, and that is the Republican Party. The incumbent president, Calvin Coolidge, decides not to run for a second full term in 1928, so the race for the Republican nomination wide open. And three candidates put themselves up for nomination. The Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover of California, Frank O. Loudon of Illinois, and Senator Charles Curtis of Kansas. Now, in the few primaries that really mattered, Hoover did not perform as well as expected, so it was thought that in case of a deadlocked convention, that either Coolidge or his vice president, Charles G. Dawes, might accept a draft, might accept the nomination if they were drafted into it. But Loudon withdrew from the race just as the convention was about to start, so Hoover really doesn't have any opposition to his nomination by the time the convention rolls around, and he receives easily the Republican nomination. And Charles Curtis is going to be nominated as his running mate. Now that we have the Republican ticket of Hoover and Curtis, let's go to the Democrats. Now, for the Democrats, with the memory of the Teapot Dome scandal rapidly fading and the current state of prosperity making the party's prospects look dim, most of the major Democratic leaders, such as William Gibbs McAdoo, were content to sit this one out. Now, one who didn't do it was the governor of New York, Al Smith. And he's tried twice before to secure the Democratic nomination, but he has opposition to him in 1928. That opposition coming from Congressman Cordell Hull of Tennessee, Senator James A. Reed of Missouri, and Adlai Pomeroy of Ohio. But at the end of the day, it is going to be Smith who receives the Democratic nomination, and he becomes the first Roman Catholic to gain a major party's nomination for president, and this will become an issue during the campaign, which we'll talk about in just a second. Smith's going to bring along for the ride Joseph T. Robinson, senator from Arkansas, as his running mate. Now that we have the Republican ticket of Hoover and Curtis and the Democratic ticket of Smith and Robinson, let's go on ahead to the campaign. Now, the big problem for Smith's campaign was his Catholicism. In the 1920s, and throughout the history of the United States, Catholicism was frowned upon. People hated Catholics. JFK would experience kind of the same problem when he runs for the presidency in 1960. That video coming up in the coming days. And Protestant ministers warned that Smith would take orders from the Pope, who many Americans sincerely believed would move to the United States from the Vatican to rule the country from a fortress in Washington if Smith won. According to a popular joke, after the election, he sent a one-word telegram advising Pope Pius XI to, quote, unpack. Now, beyond, the whole conspiracy theories and all the brouhaha, a survey of 8,500 Southern Methodist church ministers found only 4 supported Smith, and the Northern Methodist, Southern Baptist, and Disciples of Christ were similar in their opposition, so obviously Protestants were opposed vehemently to Smith, and this is really going to cut into his support in that solid South. Many Americans who sincerely rejected bigotry and the anti-Catholic KKK, which had declined during the 1920s until the 1928 campaign revived it, justified their opposition to Smith on their belief that the Catholic Church was an un-American alien culture that opposed freedom and democracy. An example of this was a statement issued in September 1928 by the National Lutheran Editors and Managers Association that opposed Smith's election. The manifesto, written by Dr. Clarence Reinhold Tappert, warned about the peculiar relation in which a faithful Catholic stands in the absolute allegiance he owes to a foreign sovereign who does not only claim supremacy also in secular affairs as a matter of principle and theory, but who, time and again, has endeavored to put this claim into practical operation. The Catholic Church, the manifesto asserted, was hostile to American principles of separation of church and state and of religious toleration. Groups circulated 1 million copies of a counterfeit oath claiming that Fourth-degree Knights of Columbus members swore to exterminate Freemasons and Protestants who commit violence against anyone, if the church so ordered. Smith's opposition to prohibition, a key reform promoted by Protestants, also lost him votes, as did his association with Tammany Hall. Of course, Tammany Hall, remember, was the political machine ran by Boss Tweed, and Smith had to get the stigma of being associated with Tammany Hall off of his campaign, which he ultimately failed to do. And prohibition was an issue that Republicans were for. Herbert Hoover was a dry candidate. He was for prohibition. The 8th prohibition was already in full swing during the 1920s with the passage of the 18th Amendment, but it was still a pretty big issue. Republicans were for prohibition. The Democrats were against prohibition. Now, because many anti-Catholics use these issues as a cover for their religious prejudices, Smith's campaign had difficulty denouncing anti-Catholicism as bigotry without offending others who favored prohibition or disliked Tammany's corruption. Now, due to these issues, the Republicans were able to make big inroads in that solid South, but we'll get to that in just a second. However, in many southern states with sizable African American populations, and where the vast majority of African Americans could not vote at the time, many believed that Hoover supported integration, or at least was not committed to maintaining segregation, which in turn overcame opposition to Smith's campaign. During the race, the governor of Mississippi, Theodore G. Bilbo, claimed that Hoover had met with a black member of the Republican National Committee and danced with her. Hoover's campaign quickly denied this and called it an untruthful and ignorable assertion. Now, Smith's religion did help him. It did help him. It helped him with Roman Catholic New England immigrants, especially Irish Americans and Italian Americans, which may explain his narrow victories in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which traditionally voted Republican, as well as his narrow loss in New York, which previous Democratic presidential candidates lost by double digits. Smith would only lose New York by 2%. Speaking of that, let's get to the results right now. Now, with the economy still prospering and the Republicans being associated with it, it's going to be an easy landslide win for Hoover and the Republicans. Hoover receives 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. 40 states end up voting Republican and voting for Hoover. 8 states end up voting for Smith and the Democrats. Now, before we get to the popular vote, if you take a look at the electoral map, like, what? What's all this red doing in the South, Juwan? I thought the Democrats helped control the South in the 1920s. Well, yes, but do remember that Protestants were opposed to Al Smith simply because he was a Catholic. The fear of Catholicism is still around in the 1920s. So this cuts into his support. in the South, and Hoover narrowly fails to carry a majority of the southern states. He's going to carry Texas, he's going to carry Florida, he's going to carry Tennessee, he's going to carry North Carolina, he's going to carry Virginia. But Al Smith manages to carry Arkansas, the home state of Joseph T. Robinson, his running mate. He's also going to carry Louisiana, he's going to carry Alabama, he's going to carry Georgia, and South Carolina. In terms of the popular votes, 58.2% of the popular vote going to Hoover, and 40.8% of the popular vote going to Al Smith. Herbert Hoover is going to serve his first term, and he's going to fight for a second one in the election of 1932, but that economic prosperity that was going on throughout the 1920s, and that kept Republicans being elected to the White House, is going to come to an end. And we'll talk about that next time in the election of 1932. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos, go ahead and watch those if you want. And with that, we will see you next time.